He faced the Germans alone. The true story of Forrest Everhart. November 12, 1944. A single American soldier stands behind a machine gun in the freezing forests of eastern France. Around him, nothing but darkness, death, and the screams of advancing German troops. His entire squad, gone. His ammunition, running low. His chances of survival, nearly zero. But Private First Class Forrest Everhart refuses to retreat. What happens next will earn him America's highest military honor and cement his name in the annals of history. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss stories of real American heroes who stood when others would have fallen. The autumn of 1944 was supposed to mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Allied forces had successfully invaded Normandy in June, liberated Paris in August, and were now pushing relentlessly toward the German border. The 90th Infantry Division, known as the Outnumbered, had been fighting through France for months, leaving behind a trail of hard-won victories and devastating losses. Among their ranks was a 22-year-old farm boy from Ohio named Forrest Eugene Everhart. Forrest wasn't the kind of soldier who stood out in formation. He was average height, quiet by nature, and preferred to let his actions speak louder than his words. Born on August 28, 1922, in the rural heartland of Ohio, he had grown up during the Great Depression, learning the value of hard work, perseverance, and never backing down from a challenge. His father had taught him to shoot when he was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady, and those lessons on the family farm would prove invaluable in the forests of France. By November 1944, the 90th Division had pushed deep into eastern France, near the German border. The landscape had transformed from the rolling countryside of Normandy to dense, forbidding forests that seemed to swallow entire battalions whole. The weather had turned bitterly cold, with frost covering the ground each morning and a bone-chilling wind that cut through even the thickest wool uniforms. The soldiers called it miserable country, and they weren't wrong. Company L of the 359th Infantry Regiment had been assigned to hold a strategic position near the town of Curling. It wasn't a glamorous assignment, but in war, every position mattered. The company had dug in along a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley, creating a defensive line that would hopefully stop any German counterattack. Everhart was assigned to a machine gun position on the left flank, a critical point in the defensive line that covered the most likely avenue of approach for enemy forces. The days leading up to November 12th had been relatively quiet. There had been sporadic artillery fire, the occasional patrol clash, and rumors of German troop movements, but nothing that suggested an imminent attack. The soldiers of Company L used the time to improve their positions, clean their weapons, and try to stay warm in the increasingly frigid weather. Everhart spent hours checking and rechecking his M1919 Browning machine gun, making sure every belt of ammunition was properly loaded and ready. He had a reputation in his squad for being meticulous, almost obsessive about his equipment. His buddies teased him about it, but they also knew that when things went bad, you wanted Forrest Everhart on your flank. On the evening of November 11th, intelligence reports indicated increased German activity in the sector. The battalion commander ordered all units to maintain heightened alert, but after weeks of similar warnings that amounted to nothing, many soldiers had become somewhat complacent. Not Everhart. Something in his gut told him this time was different. He spent that night awake, staring into the darkness of the forest, listening to every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves. His squad leader eventually ordered him to get some rest, but Everhart only dozed fitfully, his hand never far from his weapon. As dawn broke on November 12th, a thick fog had settled over the valley, reducing visibility to barely 20 yards. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, as if the birds and animals had sensed something humans could not. Everhart took his position behind his machine gun, adjusted the ammunition belt one more time, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came not from sight, but from sound. Through the fog, Everhart heard voices speaking German, closer than they should have been. Much closer. Then came the unmistakable whistle of incoming mortar rounds, followed by explosions that tore through the American positions with devastating accuracy. The Germans had somehow infiltrated close enough to direct fire with deadly precision, and they had brought overwhelming force. Within minutes, the entire defensive line erupted into chaos. German infantry, later identified as elements of the 11th Panzer Division and supporting infantry units, came pouring out of the fog in a massive assault. They had chosen their moment perfectly, using the fog as cover to mass their forces undetected. The American positions, spread thin along the ridge, suddenly found themselves facing a force that outnumbered them by more than 3-1. Everhart's machine gun came alive, spitting fire into the advancing German ranks. The Browning M1919 was a devastating weapon when properly employed, capable of firing over 500 rounds per minute, and Everhart had spent countless hours mastering its use. His first burst caught a group of German soldiers completely exposed, cutting them down before they could take cover. But for every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The German attack was not a probe or a limited assault. It was an all-out offensive designed to smash through the American lines and exploit the breakthrough. Heavy machine gun fire raked the American positions from multiple angles. Mortar rounds continued to fall with terrifying regularity. And through it all, wave after wave of German infantry pressed the attack, with a determination born of desperation. By late 1944, the Germans knew they were losing the war, but that only made them fight harder, more viciously, more willing to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable earlier in the conflict. Everhart's position on the left flank made him a priority target. German fire concentrated on his machine gun nest, kicking up geysers of dirt and shredded vegetation all around him. Bullets whined past his head, so close he could feel the heat of their passage. Shrapnel from mortar rounds peppered his position, and still he kept firing, traversing his gun back and forth, looking for targets through the smoke and fog. Then disaster struck. A German mortar round landed directly behind Everhart's position, killing or seriously wounding most of his squad. The explosion was so close that it left his ears ringing and temporarily blinded him with smoke and debris. When his vision cleared, he looked around and realized with growing horror that he was essentially alone. The men who had been fighting beside him moments before were dead or so badly wounded they could no longer fight. His squad leader was gone, either killed or forced to retreat. The supporting riflemen who had been covering his flanks had vanished into the chaos of battle. And the Germans were still coming. Through the thinning fog, Everhart could see enemy soldiers advancing toward his position, moving from cover to cover, using fire and maneuver tactics that showed they were experienced, veteran troops. They had identified his machine gun as a threat that needed to be eliminated, and they were coming for him with singular purpose. Most soldiers, finding themselves alone and facing overwhelming odds, would have retreated. Military doctrine certainly would have justified a tactical withdrawal to a more defensible position, but Forrest Everhart looked at the approaching enemy, looked at his machine gun with its remaining ammunition, and made a different choice. He decided to stay, not out of a death wish, and not because he didn't understand the danger. He stayed because he knew that if he abandoned his position, the entire left flank of the American line would collapse. The Germans would pour through the gap, and the men of Company L would be surrounded and destroyed. Everything depended on someone holding that position, even if that someone was just one farm boy from Ohio with a machine gun and rapidly dwindling ammunition. Everhart settled in behind his weapon, took a deep breath, and prepared to make his stand alone. What happened over the next several hours would become the stuff of legend, though Everhart himself would later describe it in characteristically modest terms as just doing my job. But what he did that day went far beyond duty. It entered the realm of the extraordinary, the kind of courage that seems almost superhuman until you remember it was performed by a very human young man who was probably terrified, but refused to let that terror control him. The Germans came at his position in waves, trying different approaches, different tactics, anything to dislodge the single American soldier who had become an immovable obstacle in their advance. The first assault came straight at him, infantry rushing his position while laying down suppressive fire. Everhart waited until they were close, too close to miss, and then opened fire. The Browning machine gun roared, and German soldiers fell, twisted, and died in the frozen grass. The assault broke and retreated, leaving bodies scattered across the approach to Everhart's position. But there was no time to celebrate, no time even to catch his breath. The Germans regrouped and came again, this time trying to flank him from the left. Everhart traversed his gun, engaged them at longer range, forcing them back into cover. He was firing in short, controlled bursts now, conserving ammunition, making every bullet count. His training kicked in, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought became too slow. Load, fire, traverse, adjust, fire again. The rhythm of combat became automatic. The third assault tried to use mortar fire to suppress him, while infantry moved forward under the cover of the explosions. It nearly worked. Shrapnel tore through the sandbags, protecting his position, and one fragment caught him in the shoulder, drawing blood but not incapacitating him. Everhart gritted his teeth against the pain, kept his hands on the machine gun, and continued firing. The German infantry, seeing him still active despite the mortars, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Everhart's fire cut down the exposed soldiers, and once again the assault faltered. Hour after hour, the pattern repeated. The Germans would attack, Everhart would drive them back, they would regroup and attack again. His position was surrounded on three sides now, with Germans having infiltrated past his flanks. He was truly alone, an island of American resistance in a sea of enemy forces. Communication with friendly forces had been cut off when his radio was destroyed by shrapnel. He had no idea if the rest of Company L was still fighting, had retreated, or had been overrun. For all he knew, he was the last American soldier still fighting in this sector. His ammunition situation became critical. He had started with several belts for the machine gun, but sustained firing had depleted his supply alarmingly fast. Everhart began scavenging ammunition from fallen American soldiers near his position, risking exposure to enemy fire to crawl out and retrieve ammunition cans. On one such trip, he came under direct fire from a German sniper, bullets cracking past his head as he grabbed an ammunition belt and rolled back into his position. The machine gun was his lifeline, and without ammunition, it was just an expensive piece of metal. The Germans, frustrated by their inability to dislodge one determined American, brought up heavier weapons. A German machine gun team set up a position with a direct line of fire to Everhart's nest. The MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw for its incredibly high rate of fire, was arguably the best machine gun of World War II, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. In a duel between machine gunners, the MG-42 had significant advantages, but Everhart had position, cover, and determination. When the German gun opened fire, Everhart immediately identified its location from a muzzle flash and tracer rounds. He waited for a pause in their fire, then popped up and fired a burst directly at the German position. His aim was true. The enemy machine gun fell silent. As the day wore on, the German attacks became less organized, more desperate. They had committed significant forces to eliminating this single American position and had suffered heavy casualties for their efforts. Bodies littered the ground in front of Everhart's position, testimony to the accuracy and deadliness of his fire. But still they came, driven by orders from commanders who couldn't believe one soldier could hold an entire flank by himself. Everhart's hands were blistered and bleeding from handling the hot machine gun barrel. His shoulder throbbed where the shrapnel had hit him. His ears rang continuously from the concussion of explosions and the roar of his own weapon. Exhaustion tugged at his consciousness, but adrenaline and sheer willpower kept him alert and fighting. As afternoon faded toward evening on November 12th, the character of the battle began to change. The German attacks, while still determined, had lost some of their initial ferocity. The enemy commanders were beginning to realize that this single American position was not going to fall easily, and the casualties they were sustaining in the attempt were becoming unsustainable. But they couldn't simply bypass Everhart's position either. As long as he controlled that piece of ground, He threatened any German advance in the sector. Everhart, for his part, was reaching the limits of human endurance. He had been fighting continuously for over 8 hours, under constant fire, with no food, no water, and no rest. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. He had one belt left for the machine gun, maybe 250 rounds, and after that, he would be down to his M1 Garand rifle and whatever ammunition he could find. The math was simple and grim. When the ammunition ran out, the position would fall. But unknown to Everhart, his incredible stand had not gone unnoticed. Other American units in the sector, while fighting their own desperate battles, had observed the heavy German attacks concentrated on the left flank. They had heard the distinctive sound of an American machine gun firing, hour after hour, despite everything the Germans threw at it. Word began to spread through the American lines that someone on the left flank was still fighting, still holding, refusing to give up. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel someone whose name would become lost to history, but whose decision would prove crucial, realized that if the left flank could hold just a little longer, he could organize a counterattack. He pulled together every available soldier, scraped together reserves that barely existed, and prepared to launch a relief operation. It was a desperate gamble, but the entire day had been desperate, and the man holding the left flank deserved every effort to save him. As the German forces massed for what they intended to be a final, overwhelming assault on Everhart's position, the young soldier from Ohio prepared for what he thought might be his last fight. He checked his final ammunition belt, made sure his rifle was loaded, fixed his bayonet, and steeled himself for the inevitable. He had done everything possible, fought beyond any reasonable expectation, and if this was where his war ended, at least he would go down fighting. The German assault began with a heavy artillery barrage, shells screaming overhead to explode behind Everhart's position, cutting off any possible retreat. Then came the infantry, more than Everhart had seen all day, a mass of field-gray uniforms surging forward with grim determination. They were going to take this position no matter the cost, and they were willing to pay in blood. Everhart opened fire with his last belt of ammunition. The machine gun bucked and roared, tracer round streaming into the advancing German ranks. Men fell, but others kept coming. The range closed to 50 yards, then 40, then 30. Everhart could see their faces now, see the fear and determination mixed in equal measure. The machine gun fired its last round and went silent. Without hesitation, Everhart dropped behind the weapon, grabbed his M1 Garand, and continued firing. The rifle didn't have the devastating firepower of the machine gun, but in Everhart's hands it was still deadly. 8 rounds in the clip, fire until empty, slam in a new clip, fire again. The familiar ping of the empty clip ejecting became the rhythm of his last stand. Germans fell, but still they came. The range closed to 20 yards, close enough for Everhart to see the details of their uniforms, the expressions on their faces. And then, like a miracle, American voices shouted from behind the German lines. The counterattack had arrived. The relief force, led by officers who had heard about the lone soldier holding the left flank, crashed into the German rear with desperate fury. Caught between Everhart's position in front and fresh American troops behind, the German assault collapsed. Enemy soldiers, who moments before had been closing in for the kill, suddenly found themselves fighting for their own survival. The battle that had raged all day ended in a matter of minutes. German forces, already exhausted from the day's fighting and shocked by the unexpected American counterattack, broke and retreated. Some surrendered on the spot, too tired and too shocked to run. Others melted back into the forest, seeking to escape the trap that had closed around them. And in his lonely machine gun nest, Forrest Everhart finally allowed himself to believe he might actually survive this day. When the first American soldiers reached Everhart's position, they stopped and stared in disbelief. The scene before them looked like something from a nightmare. Bodies of German soldiers lay scattered across the approaches, some within 20 yards of Everhart's machine gun. Spent brass casings covered the ground around the weapon, thousands of them, glinting dully in the fading light. The sandbags that had provided Everhart's cover were shredded by bullets and shrapnel. The machine gun itself was scorching hot, its barrel nearly glowing from sustained fire. And there, in the middle of this carnage, sat Forrest Everhart. His uniform was torn and bloody. His hands were blistered and raw. His face was blackened with powder smoke and dirt. He was holding his rifle, still pointing toward where the enemy had been, and he looked up at the approaching American soldiers with an expression that was equal parts relief, exhaustion, and residual combat intensity. For a long moment, nobody spoke. What could you say to a man who had just done the impossible? The squad leader of the relief force, a grizzled sergeant who had seen his share of combat, finally found his voice. "Son," he said quietly, "you just held off an entire German battalion by yourself." Everhart, too exhausted for modesty or pride, simply nodded. "Somebody had to," he replied. It was the most understated description of extraordinary courage anyone had ever heard. As medics arrived to treat Everhart's wounds, which proved to be numerous but not life-threatening, officers began piecing together what had actually happened that day. The evidence told an incredible story. Based on the ammunition expended, the bodies recovered, and the testimonies of both American and captured German soldiers, it became clear that Everhart had single-handedly held a critical position for over 10 hours against repeated attacks by vastly superior enemy forces. The German commanders, when interrogated, expressed disbelief that their attacks had been stopped by one soldier. They had assumed they were facing a reinforced position with multiple machine guns and supporting weapons. The idea that one man alone could inflict such casualties and maintain such effective fire was simply beyond their understanding. Some German officers initially refused to believe it, insisting that American reports must be exaggerated propaganda. But the evidence was undeniable, and eventually, even the Germans acknowledged the extraordinary nature of Everhart's stand. In the days following the battle, Everhart's story spread through the 90th Infantry Division like wildfire. Soldiers who had been there, who had heard that machine gun firing hour after hour, shared their accounts. Officers compiled reports. The battalion commander personally interviewed Everhart, though the young soldier remained characteristically modest about his actions. He hadn't done anything special, he insisted, just his job. Any other soldier would have done the same. The battalion commander, who had seen many soldiers in his career and knew courage when he saw it, disagreed strongly. The paperwork for Everhart's Medal of Honor citation began moving up the chain of command. In the midst of a massive war where thousands of acts of courage occurred daily, truly extraordinary actions could sometimes get lost in the bureaucracy. But not this time. Too many people had witnessed what Everhart did. Too many soldiers owed their lives to stand on that left flank. The citation moved quickly through channels, endorsed at every level by officers who recognized that what Everhart had done represented the highest ideals of military service. On June 12, 1945, several months after the battle and after the war in Europe had ended, Private First Class Forrest Eugene Everhart stood in dress uniform before senior military officers. The citation was read aloud, describing in official language what everyone present already knew, that on November 12, 1944, near Curling, France, Everhart had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor was placed around his neck, and Everhart, still modest, still uncomfortable with attention, accepted America's highest military decoration for his actions that day. But for Everhart, the medal was never about personal glory. In later years, when asked about that day, he always insisted he was just doing what any soldier would do. He fought not for medals or recognition, but for the men beside him, for the country he loved, and because retreat was simply not in his nature. The farm boy from Ohio, who had learned to shoot on his father's land, had become a symbol of American courage and determination. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Forrest Everhart faced a challenge that millions of other veterans also confronted: how to return to normal life after experiencing the extremes of combat. He had seen and done things that no amount of training could truly prepare someone for. He had looked death in the face and refused to blink. He carried physical scars from his wounds, but the deeper scars, the ones that don't show, would take longer to heal. Everhart returned to Ohio a decorated hero, but he shunned the spotlight. Parades were held in his honor. Newspapers wanted interviews, and local dignitaries wanted to shake his hand and be photographed with the Medal of Honor recipient. Everhart endured these obligations with the same quiet determination he had shown on the battlefield, but it was clear he would have preferred to simply blend back into civilian life. The attention made him uncomfortable. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes, in his mind, were the men who hadn't come home, the ones who still lay in military cemeteries across Europe. The transition to peacetime was difficult. Everhart struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1945 they called it combat fatigue, or shell shock, and understood it far less than we do today. He had nightmares about that day in November, dreams where he ran out of ammunition and the German soldiers kept coming, where he was overwhelmed and killed. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, sometimes unsure for a moment whether he was in his bedroom in Ohio or back in that machine gun nest in France. But Everhart was determined not to let the war define the rest of his life. He had fought to protect the American way of life, and now he was going to live it. He met a woman named Dorothy Hudson, and in her he found someone who could understand without needing every detail explained. They married and began building a life together, focused on the future rather than dwelling on the past. It was exactly what Everhart needed: normalcy, routine, the simple pleasures of peacetime existence. The couple had 6 children together, and Everhart threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he had shown on the battlefield. He taught his children the values his own father had taught him: hard work, honesty, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. He rarely talked about the war with his children when they were young. The Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer, brought out only occasionally. His children knew their father was a war hero, but they knew him primarily as Dad, the man who helped with homework, who took them fishing, who taught them to shoot just as his own father had taught him. In 1947, Everhart took a job with the Veterans Administration in Southern Ohio. It was meaningful work, helping other veterans navigate the bureaucracy of benefits and services they had earned through their service. Everhart understood these men in a way few others could. He knew what they had been through, knew the challenges they faced in readjusting to civilian life. His own experiences made him empathetic and effective in his role, and he quickly became known as someone who would fight for veterans' rights as tenaciously as he had fought against the Germans. He worked for the VA for 37 years, a career that spanned nearly 4 decades. He saw the veterans of World War II grow older, welcomed home the veterans of Korea, and eventually worked with the returning veterans of Vietnam. Each generation of veterans faced unique challenges, but Everhart saw the common threads: young men and women who had served their country and deserved support when they came home. When he finally retired, he received the Distinguished Career Award from the VA, recognition for a lifetime of service that had begun on a battlefield in France and continued in the quiet offices of the Veterans Administration. Throughout these decades, Everhart maintained connections with other veterans of the 90th Infantry Division. Annual reunions brought together the men who had served together, who had shared the dangers and hardships of combat. These gatherings were important to Everhart. With other veterans, he could talk about things that civilians couldn't fully understand. They shared a bond forged in combat, a brotherhood that transcended the years and distance. At these reunions, Everhart was treated with deep respect, not just for his Medal of Honor, but for the quiet dignity and humility he maintained throughout his life. As his children grew older and began to understand more about their father's war service, they sometimes asked questions. Everhart would answer, but always briefly, always focusing on his fellow soldiers rather than his own actions. He told stories about the men he served with, about their courage, their humor, their sacrifice. He talked about the importance of duty and doing what's right even when you're afraid. His children came to understand that their father was indeed a hero, but more importantly, he was a good man who had faced an extraordinary situation and risen to meet it. As the decades passed and Forrest Everhart moved through middle age toward his senior years, the significance of his actions on November 12, 1944, only grew more apparent. Military historians studied the battle, using it as a case study in individual courage and the importance of tactical positions. The stand at Curling became a standard example taught at military academies, demonstrating how one determined soldier in the right position could influence the outcome of a much larger engagement. In the 1970s and 1980s, as America grappled with the legacy of Vietnam and changing attitudes toward military service, Everhart's story took on new meaning. His example of courage and determination, free from political controversy, reminded Americans of a time when the nation was united in a clear cause. He never made political statements or tried to leverage his status as a Medal of Honor recipient for any agenda beyond helping fellow veterans. This restraint only added to his reputation. Everhart was occasionally asked to speak at schools, military events, and veterans gatherings. He always accepted these invitations, viewing them as opportunities to honor his fellow veterans rather than himself. His speeches were never long and never focused on his own heroism. Instead, he talked about the ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things during the war. He emphasized that he was just one soldier among millions, and that the real heroes were the ones who hadn't come home. When speaking to young people, especially students, Everhart had a simple message: character matters. When faced with a critical moment, you discover what you're really made of. He told them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. He explained that doing the right thing often means doing the hard thing, and that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about fulfilling your responsibilities, even when no one is watching. These lessons, delivered in his quiet, modest manner, resonated deeply with audiences. The 90th Infantry Division, the Tough Hombres, embraced Everhart as one of their most distinguished members. Division reunions always featured recognition of their Medal of Honor recipient, and younger veterans of the division, those who served in later decades, were inspired by his example. The division's history was filled with tales of courage and sacrifice, but Everhart's story stood out even among these remarkable accounts. In his later years, Everhart finally began to open up more about that day in November 1944. Perhaps the passage of time made it easier, or perhaps he recognized the historical importance of preserving first-hand accounts before they were lost forever. Interviews conducted in the early 1980s captured his memories in his own words, providing invaluable primary source material for historians. Even in these detailed recollections, Everhart's modesty shone through. He described events matter-of-factly, without embellishment, always emphasizing that he simply did what needed to be done. The impact of Everhart's actions extended beyond military circles. His story became part of the larger narrative of World War II, that vast conflict that shaped the modern world. Books about the war included his story. Documentary filmmakers sought to interview him, and his hometown in Ohio took great pride in their local hero. A section of highway was named in his honor, and his photograph hung in the local VFW hall, a reminder to future generations of what one man could accomplish when pushed to his limits. For the soldiers who had served with Everhart or who had been saved by his actions that day, he remained a figure of deep respect and gratitude. Some of these men had survived the war only because Everhart held that position and prevented the German breakthrough. They knew it, and they never forgot it. Letters of gratitude arrived periodically throughout his life, from veterans or their families, thanking him for his courage and sacrifice. Everhart kept these letters, and they meant more to him than any medal. The military community continued to honor Everhart's service. He was invited to participate in Medal of Honor ceremonies, where recipients from different wars and different generations came together. These events connected Everhart to a unique fraternity, men who had all faced death and chosen to act with extraordinary courage. The mutual respect among Medal of Honor recipients was profound, each recognizing in the other's a quality that transcended words. As the 40th anniversary of the battle approached in 1984, there was renewed interest in Everhart's story. He agreed to return to France, to visit the site where he had made his stand. Standing on that ground 4 decades later, now an older man accompanied by fellow veterans and military historians, Everhart looked across the terrain that had once been filled with German soldiers trying to kill him. The forest was peaceful now, quiet except for the wind in the trees. The scars of war had long since healed, though the memories never fully faded. During that visit to France, local residents who remembered the battle came to meet Everhart. Some were children during the war who had hidden in cellars while the fighting raged overhead. Others were resistance fighters who had worked behind German lines. They thanked him for his part in liberating their country, and Everhart, characteristically, thanked them for their courage and sacrifice. It was a moving reunion, a connection across decades and cultures, united by shared history and mutual respect. By the mid-1980s, Forrest Everhart was in his early 60s, retired from the Veterans Administration, and surrounded by a large family that included not just his 6 children, but a growing number of grandchildren. He had lived a full life, rich in relationships and meaningful work, but his body, which had endured the hardships of combat and carried the scars of war for 4 decades, was beginning to fail him. In 1985, Everhart was diagnosed with lung cancer. It was an aggressive form of the disease, and the prognosis was not good. He faced this final battle with the same courage he had shown on the battlefield, but this was an enemy that courage alone couldn't defeat. He underwent treatment, endured the difficult side effects of chemotherapy, and tried to maintain as much normalcy as possible for his family. But the cancer was relentless. Throughout his illness, Everhart remained focused on his family and his fellow veterans. Even as his strength faded, he continued to attend veterans events when possible, not wanting to let down the men who looked to him as an example. His fellow veterans watched with sadness as this giant among them struggled with an enemy far different from the Germans he had faced in France. Some visited him at home, and these visits became opportunities to reminisce about their shared experiences, to laugh about the good times, and remember the friends who had fallen. Everhart's children, now adults with families of their own, came to spend time with their father during these difficult months. They listened as he shared stories he had never told before, opened up about his experiences in ways he never had when they were younger. It was as if, knowing his time was limited, he wanted to ensure these memories and lessons were passed on. He talked about the importance of standing up for what's right, of never backing down from challenge, of maintaining integrity even when no one else would know if you compromised. To his grandchildren, Everhart was simply Grandpa, the kind old man who told interesting stories and made them feel safe and loved. They didn't fully understand yet what he had done during the war, but they absorbed the values he embodied: kindness, strength, humility, and an unshakable sense of duty. These lessons would stay with them long after he was gone, shaping another generation in ways both subtle and profound. On August 30th, 1986, 2 days after his 64th birthday, Forrest Eugene Everhart lost his final battle. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by family, having fought the cancer with the same determination he had shown against the German army. His passing was noted in newspapers across Ohio and in military publications nationwide. The Medal of Honor recipient, who had once stood alone against overwhelming odds, had finally been overcome by an enemy that eventually defeats us all. His funeral was held with full military honors. Veterans from the 90th Infantry Division, some traveling from across the country despite their own advanced age, attended to pay their respects. The flag-draped coffin was carried by an honor guard, and a bugler played taps as Forrest Everhart was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, the hallowed ground where America's heroes sleep. He was buried among other Medal of Honor recipients, other soldiers who had answered their nation's call and given everything they had. The legacy Everhart left behind extends far beyond his immediate family or even the military community. His story continues to inspire new generations of Americans. Military academies still study his actions as an example of individual initiative and courage under fire. His photograph hangs in the 90th Infantry Division Museum, and his name appears on memorials dedicated to Medal of Honor recipients. But perhaps the most important aspect of Everhart's legacy is what his story teaches us about ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary circumstances. He wasn't born a hero. He didn't possess superhuman abilities. He was a farm boy from Ohio who, when tested in the crucible of combat, discovered depths of courage and determination he probably didn't know he possessed. His story reminds us that heroism isn't reserved for a special few, but is a potential that exists within ordinary people who choose to do the right thing when it matters most. In the years since his death, historians have continued to examine the Battle of November 12, 1944. The more they study it, the more remarkable Everhart's achievement appears. The odds he faced, the duration of his stand, the impact he had on the larger battle. All of these factors combine to make his actions truly exceptional. Some military historians have called it one of the most remarkable individual combat actions of World War II, a conflict filled with remarkable combat actions. Everhart's 6 children have worked to preserve their father's memory and ensure his story continues to be told. They've shared his letters, photographs, and personal effects with museums and historical societies. They've spoken to student groups and veterans organizations, carrying forward the lessons their father taught them. Through their efforts, Forrest Everhart remains more than just a name in history books. He remains a real person whose courage continues to inspire. The site in France where Everhart made a stand is now peaceful farmland, returned to productive use decades ago. There's no grand monument there, no tourist attraction marking the spot where one American soldier held off a German battalion. But local residents remember, and occasionally American veterans or their families visit, wanting to stand on the ground where such extraordinary courage was displayed. The earth itself seems to hold the memory of what happened there on that cold November day in 1944. For young people today, living in a world shaped by the outcome of World War II, Everhart's story offers valuable lessons. It demonstrates that individual actions matter, that one person making the right choice can make a real difference. It shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. It reminds us that duty and honor aren't old-fashioned concepts, but timeless values that give meaning and purpose to our lives. The Medal of Honor that Everhart received hangs now in a place of honor, preserved as a reminder of his sacrifice and courage. But the real memorial to Forrest Everhart isn't made of metal or stone. It lives in the hearts of those who were inspired by his example, in the soldiers who drew courage from his story when they faced their own battles, in the veterans who found meaning in his dedication to serving others, and in the generations of Americans who learned from his life that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Forrest Eugene Everhart faced the Germans alone on November 12, 1944, and in doing so, he created a legacy that would outlive him by generations. He proved that one man, armed with courage, determination, and an unshakable sense of duty, could stand against overwhelming odds and prevail. His story reminds us of the best of what America can be. Ordinary citizens who rise to meet extraordinary challenges, who do what's right rather than what's easy, who serve something greater than themselves. As we remember Forrest Everhart today, more than 3 decades after his death and 8 decades after his heroic stand, we honor not just his actions on that single day, but the life he lived afterward. He returned from war, raised a family, served his fellow veterans, and lived with quiet dignity and humility. He never sought fame or fortune from his Medal of Honor. He simply tried to live a good life and help others along the way. That, perhaps, is the most inspiring part of his story. That true heroism doesn't end when the shooting stops, but continues in how we choose to live our lives every day. Forrest Everhart was a hero on the battlefield, but he was also a hero in the much longer, harder battle of living a life of integrity, service, and love. He faced the Germans alone, but he never faced life alone. He had family, friends, and fellow veterans who stood with him through all the years that followed. And now, his story stands as inspiration for all of us. A reminder that when the moment comes, when we're tested and challenged, when everything seems impossible and retreat seems reasonable, we too can find the courage to stand our ground. We too can face whatever enemy confronts us, whether on a battlefield or in the battles of daily life, and refuse to give up. We too can be heroes, not by seeking glory, but by simply doing what's right, no matter the cost. Forrest Eugene Everhart, soldier, hero, husband, father, veteran advocate, and an ordinary American who did something extraordinary. His story will never be forgotten, and his example will continue to inspire as long as people value courage, duty, and sacrifice. He faced the Germans alone, and in doing so, he joined the immortal company of heroes whose names will echo through history. The story of Forrest Everhart reminds us that heroes aren't born. They're made in moments of crisis, when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. A farm boy from Ohio became one of America's most decorated soldiers, not because he sought glory, but because he refused to abandon his post and his fellow soldiers. His legacy lives on, inspiring new generations to stand firm when tested, to do what's right when it's difficult, and to serve something greater than themselves. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. These stories of American courage must never be forgotten. What would you have done in Everhart's position? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember, courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it.